Most of our recent lectures are devoted to the application of relevance theory in the analysis of particular aspects of linguistic communication, or verbal communication, I should say, not linguistic. And this is just one more lecture, more or less about the same, that is how to use relevance theory in the interpretation of a peculiar type of verbal humor. Relevance theorists strongly believe that the principle of relevance is the only tool that is needed to account for all instances of communication, whether it is an academic lecture or whether it is a joke or a poem, whatever. So we always follow the same comprehensive procedure. The ability to engage in humor results from the automatic interpretation of ostensive stimuli as consistent with the principle of relevance and the possession of a high-order theory of mind. Possession of high-order theory of mind, perhaps you remember the term, this is capacity for meta-representing. We discussed it when talking about meta-representation. Some instances of intentional humor consists in implicitly making a specific type of dissociative comment about a certain aspect of the world or an attributable thought. So the study of how speakers implicitly express and here is retrieve prepositional attitudes. So let me explain the last paragraph. We'll try to analyze our perception of a particular type of humor, humor that is connected with irony, with sarcasm, that is humor in which the speaker implicitly shows his attitude of dissociation, his attitude of rejection towards a particular belief or a particular set of values. So that type of humor is represented by Oscar Wilde or by Woody Allen, for instance. The derivation of a humorous interpretation may involve the entertainment of two contradictory propositional contents. The hearer is encouraged to supply a strongly implicated premise that clashes with an accessible, though so far unaccessed, assumption. So let me perhaps illustrate the point. Don't tell the lady you're unworthy of her. Let it be a complete surprise. So if you analyze the first sentence, don't tell the lady you're unworthy of her, an accessible assumption, that is a target assumption, is that the addressee is worthy of the lady. And this assumption stands in contradiction with the following one: let it be a complete surprise. So the addressee is unworthy of the lady. This is strongly implicated premise, which is called key assumption. So the target assumption and the key assumption are in contradiction, and this is the cause of entertainment. We simply share two contradictory propositional contents. Let us analyze some further examples in which the humorous effect is derived from this contradiction of two assumptions, that is target assumption and key assumption. There is something tragic about the enormous number of young people there are in England at the present moment who start life with a perfect profile and end up by adopting some useful profession. So a useful profession is a cause for congratulation. This is an accessible target assumption. This is not strongly implicated, but this is quite likely to be found among the assumptions entertained by the audience, and it stands in contradiction to the assumption that is strongly communicated. A useful profession is not a cause for congratulation. So this is a strongly implicated premise. There is no question that there is an unseen world. The problem is how far it is from Midtown and how late it is open. An unseen world has some physically determined spatial temporal location. An unsealed world has not some physically determined spatial temporal location. It is perfectly monstrous the way people go about nowadays saying things against one behind one's back that are absolutely and entirely true. The things people tell against one behind one's back are false. This is a target assumption. The things people tell against one behind one's back are not false. This is a key assumption. So all the above examples involve incongruity, because contradiction can be perceived as incongruity. So now perhaps we'll discuss the perception of the incongruous. Now, relevant theories believe that incongruity is not a property of the object itself, so it is not a matter of the structural properties of the text, but it is a feature of the relation between the object and the subject who perceives it. A stimulus is incongruous when it differs from the cognitive model of reference. A cognitive model is what a subject constructs as a result of the contents of his experience and the process through which he organizes knowledge. So we construct certain models of references, we find something more or less cohesive, coherent, and if we come across an element that deviates from that coherence, we may either disregard the deviation if it is of minor character, or we face a problem and then we have to do something about it. Okay, but the point here is that incongruity is not a structural property of the text, but it is, we perceive as the receivers, we perceive incongruity, we can notice it. So it is, let's say, a mental process identifying incongruity. It is not just the feature of the text. By placing the emphasis on the relationship of the stimulus to the mental life of the individual and not on the structural properties of the stimulus, we can propose an approach that concentrates on processes of interpretation rather than on textual structures. So in other words, relevance theory differs from all other analyses of humor in that it does not try to identify a structural element that is responsible for the emergence of humor, but it believes that the perception of humor can be explained in terms of processing, different type of processing. Now, cognitive models of reference based on experience are bound to be unstable. How far can models be stretched congruously, and when is new information found incongruous? Now, perhaps some information is first processed as incongruous and later, through some adjustment of the model, gets integrated and turns congruous. Thus, the concept of incongruity is central to cognition and not specific to humor. Again, this is important, mind you, because they want to say that that our perception of incongruity is more a matter of our cognitive system and not a matter of communication as such, or humor in particular. So again, the problem is within our mind and not on the level of the text. It seems that humor is not to be characterized in terms of the nature of the specific type of incongruity from which it arises, but by a pattern of specific effects derived in the processing the incongruity. So this is just the same all over again, but perhaps phrased in a slightly different way. What is claimed here is that we should not concentrate on the properties of the text, and we should not list specific features of the text that seem to be responsible for humor, but I mean, features of the text in the sense of incongruities of the text, specific types of incongruities, but we should concentrate on human ability to process incongruity, to deal with incongruity at the perceptive level. What follows, again, is a general remark concerning our cognition and not particularly humor. Before we discuss humor, let's just concentrate on the perception of incongruity. Any organism interested in improving its cognitive environment will attempt to minimize inconsistencies in its representation system. So this is perceptive defense. We follow congruency principle. We just want to avoid cognitive dissonance. That is, we want to put it plainly, we need some kind of harmony in our cognitive system, in all what we know. Okay, we just want it to be harmonious. And if we come across something that is not, then we have to do something with it, okay? Not very salient incongruities will tend to go unnoticed. The difference is not worth processing, so we will just ignore these differences. They will be accommodated into the system in such a way that strongly held basic beliefs are not shattered. When incongruities are salient and get fully processed, cognitive effects are derived to reduce an increased congruency in the representational system. So, in other words, if something is of minor importance, I mean this difference is of minor importance, we tend to neglect it. But our general beliefs remain intact, unshattered, unchanged. But if this incongruity is substantial, then we are again somehow alarmed, and it cannot go unnoticed. We have to introduce some change into the representational system. Now, two clashing propositional contents constitute a challenge to the stability of the set of our beliefs. A hearer must find an interpretation that either eliminates or prevents the inconsistencies that the incongruous propositional contents might give rise to. The incongruity has been produced as a consequence of an assumption communicated strongly. How does a hearer manipulate it so as to produce a congruous set of representations? So, in other words, the hearer has a certain set of beliefs. For example, the hearer believes that it is desirable to have a good job as a young person. This is something that the hearer knows. And then he faces a contradictory statement. So now he faces incongruity, and this incongruity cannot be eliminated. The hearer has to do something. So the hearer has to produce again a congruous set of representations, because this is the natural drive of his cognitive system. So then we will try to see what to do with that. So the hearer may process incongruity in two different ways. He can either revise the set of beliefs he holds, or he can revise the interpretation he has given to an utterance. The hearer will revise his beliefs when no revision of an interpretation which is found consistent with the principle of relevance can be recovered. Because this is based upon the calculation of the effort involved. Okay, so the hearer will follow the path of least effort. Incongruity is only instrumental in creating humorous effects, but is not, on its own, responsible for them. incongruity is of significance in humour in that it demands additional processing effort and hence calls for additional effects, pushing the interpretation beyond the mere propositional contents of the assumptions made manifest by the utterance. There is a clear indication that nothing about the incongruity itself is specific to humour. My wife is waiting for me next door. Let's assume that before hearing this utterance, the addressee presumed that the speaker was not married. So the speaker strongly believes that, the hearer strongly believes that the speaker is not married. Then the speaker says, my wife is waiting for me next door. So now, these two assumptions, they previously held that the speaker is not married, and now the new assumption that was added by the speaker by uttering, my wife is waiting for me, stand in contradiction. So there is an incongruity. But this incongruity does not result in a humorous interpretation. Even though the implicated premise contradicts the assumption so far held, there is no humorous effect. So as you can see, incongruity is merely instrumental. It does not have to result in the derivation of the humorous effect. In humorous cases, the contradiction cannot be resolved by mere elimination of one of the clashing assumptions, as above. In this example above, as you can see, it is relatively easy to do because you simply come to the conclusion that you were wrong. So you eliminate your previously held assumption and you replace it with a new assumption. But in humorous cases, it is not so. The interpretation undergoes revision. So it is not that you somehow modify the set of your beliefs, but you have to modify the interpretation. Relevance theory predicts that inferencing cannot stop with the entertainment of the incongruous. So you notice the incongruity, but then you look for further cognitive effects. So there are two contradictory statements, and the hearer cannot easily decide which of the two assumptions should be entertained with greater strength. One is strongly communicated, the other belongs to the set of beliefs. Although it can be held with any of various degrees of strength, it is a taken for granted assumption. It is retrieved from the memory with a high degree of initial plausibility and hence a high degree of strength. The incongruity of two assumptions is a potential source of extra cognitive effects. So one more time, there are these two contradictory statements, and one is strongly communicated. So the speaker says that it is a stupid thing to have a good job when you're a young person. So it is strongly communicated. The other one is not strongly communicated, but is easily accessible from the set of your beliefs. You have always been told that it is a good thing to have a good job at the beginning of your career. So this is something that you strongly believe. Obviously, it doesn't have to be so that this assumption is held with such a high degree of strength, but in most cases it is. And now, this clash of two assumptions, more or less equal in strength, is maybe the source of a potential cognitive effect responsible for humor. Mind you that these two contradictory statements appear in a speech of one speaker. So as if one speaker believed two contradictory statements. No rational speaker will put forward and endorse two contradictory assumptions at a time. In contrast to cases where the contradiction does not yield humorous effects, In intentional humor, the speaker calculates that the contradictory assumption is likely to be accessed by the hearer. As two clashing assumptions come with a similar degree of strength, the contradiction cannot be eliminated by the rejection of one of them. Hearers will then attempt an expansion of their interpretation, searching for additional contextual effects derivable from the contradiction. So, mind you, what is perhaps worth stressing here is that the speaker knows very well that the hearer will derive this assumption that is not strongly communicated, but that is retrieved from the memory. So the speaker knows that in fact the audience will face the contradiction of two assumptions. The possibility that the speaker is attributing one of the two clashing assumptions to someone else becomes accessible to the hearer, and so is the likelihood that the speaker could be holding a non-endorsing attitude to it. Now we are back to irony and its interpretation within relevance theory. Ironic utterances are regarded as instances of echoic use. So it is believed that the speaker echoically repeats someone's utterance, or perhaps relates someone's attributed thought, and at the same time indicates his attitude of dissociation. So, for instance, if someone has said, "It will be a lovely day for a picnic," and then the day of the picnic comes and it's raining cats and dogs, and the speaker might say, "Yes, indeed, it is a lovely day for a picnic." So by repeating someone else's words, the speaker expresses in this particular context the attitude of dissociation, the attitude of rejection. So what we recognize is in this repetition is obviously a public meta-representation, that is the quotation, and at the same time this quotation is used not to relate what someone else has said, but mainly it is used to express the speaker's ironical critical attitude. So irony is interpreted in relevance theory as echoic use, interpretive use, and the speaker simply does not endorse the sentence that he is repeating. And you can notice the same line of reasoning in the analysis of that type of humour which consists in witticisms. So if we face these two clashing assumptions, then we may conclude that the speaker expresses his attitude of dissociation towards one of them. The speaker is implicitly expressing his attitude of dissociation from the target assumption. So this attitude of dissociation means self-distancing. Emotional overtones are not present, okay? So I simply believe that it shouldn't be like that. I simply believe that we should not try to find a good job at the start of our career, that it is not the time for such serious problems. Now, humor in this case will consist in implicitly calling into question some taken for granted aspects in the world and doing it with a certain attitude of disengagement. So here we are back to the relevant theoretic interpretation of echo, definition of echo. What can be echoed? What can be meta-represented, perhaps you remember. It can be any material encoded by an utterance, actual or potential. So it does not have to be a real utterance. It may be an imaginary utterance, a virtual utterance that we attribute to someone that's quite potential. Now, it may be the proposition expressed by an utterance, but it might also be a thought that we attribute to someone. So it may be either a public meta-representation or a mental meta-representation. Here, in our example, it is a thought attributable to someone else. It is a belief commonly shared. It is a socially accepted virtue. So if you remember the context that is Victorian society, though these are the virtues cherished by that kind of society and somehow ridiculed by Oscar Wilde. The role of the key assumption and of incongruities as generated is to make the target assumption accessible, retrieved from memory and salient. So highly salient assumptions are targets of echo. The utterance itself is not used echoically, it is just indirect echoic use. So one more time, there is a sense the procedure follows like that. The key assumption that is communicated strongly, that the speaker verbalizes, makes it easy for us to derive this target assumption. It becomes easily accessible, and we retrieve it from our contextual resources, from our memory, and it becomes salient, it becomes prominent, it becomes relevant, and it becomes the target of an echo. So this is the assumption that is somehow ridiculed by the speaker. And they say it is indirect, an indirect echoic use, because it is not uttered. Actually, we have to retrieve it from memory and then realize that this is what is being echoed. Our ability to understand that kind of humor seems to be due to our capacity for meta-representation. If you remember, we discussed this capacity when talking about various types of meta-representation and attributing intentions to others and various mental states to others. So actually we can explain various instances of humor, including witticisms, by reference to human capacity for meta-representing and the principle of relevance. So engagement in meta-representational thought, that is attribution of dissociative attitude to the speaker, which represents that capacity, and the interpretation of an ostensive stimulus as consistent with the principle of relevance. These two elements are sufficient to account for humor, and in particular this humor which is represented by witty, paradoxical remarks. So capacity for humor involves a combination of our tendency to interpret an ostensive stimuli as consistent with the principle of relevance and our possession of a higher order theory of mind. Thank you for your attention.